They set out into a white world so flat it erased distance. The sky hung like a lid. The land below was a ribbed sheet of limestone, bone-colored, bleeding salt into the glare. Horses staggered, flanks heaving, their breath tasting of dust and dead salt. A kettle boiled once and was drained dry. Men counted days in whispers, stretching rope over the horizon like a measure that could not be trusted. This is the first of the shocks the 1840 expedition would reveal. The continent's belly would not surrender a lake to the map. Only a relentless, indifferent plain that would test every assumption a colony had made about Australia's interior. By 1840, the question that obsessed South Australian officials was deceptively simple. What lay between their infant settlement and the western shore? A century of European mapping had enclosed most of the continent's rim. Matthew Flinders had charted the coastline with precision decades earlier, but inland remained a rumour and a hope. Uneven rainfall and a thin scatter of settlements left a vast blank on the maps, and speculation hardened into conviction among many colonists that an inland sea might cleave the continent. If such a sea existed, a land route linking east and west could transform trade, security, even the colony's destiny. It was a dream of connection, shorter trips, clearer claim staking, the ability to move stock and people across a continent that otherwise resisted such ambitions. But the Nullarbor Plain, its name literally meaning no trees, was not a convenient hole on a chart to be filled. It was a limestone plateau spanning roughly 77,000 square miles, a broad expanse with a salt-stiff surface and a subterranean architecture of caves and sinkholes that hid whatever moisture the land did hold. Average rainfall across much of this flat is thin, near 10 inches a year in many places, so signs of life are deceptive. Scrub and sparse thickets rupture the landscape, giving the illusion of pasture that evaporates under the drying heat. Temperatures could swing from oven heat at noon to a night that cut to the bone. These were not obstacles to be overcome by will alone. They were impartial facts that would shape every decision, every death, every small cruelty of necessity the expedition would accept. Into this geological and colonial tinderbox rode Edward John Eyre. Not a mysterious aristocrat nor a distant official, Eyre was a man whose authority came from practical success. He had driven stock over long distances, had a reputation as stubborn and capable on the track. He knew how to measure distance by land, how to predict the behavior of animals, and he was restless, ambitious for a task that would prove him. The government of South Australia, anxious to fill in the map and to test the prospects of overland connection, chose Eyre to lead a force that would solve a problem rumour and topography had left unsolved. What Eyre was given and what he took reflected the era's confidence and its blind spots. He carried maps that stitched coastal surveys to sparse inland reports, instruments to measure and record, a contingent of men, a string of horses, and a store of provisions meant to be stretched across an unforgiving plain. At first the plan was straightforward enough. Push northward from Adelaide toward the centre, follow riverbeds and salt lakes, find any depression that might reveal water, and determine if a sea lay beyond. The party moved out with a mixture of official support and frontier improvisation. Men would return with news that could alter the colony's fate. Failure would be counted quietly as part of the cost of empire. Their first stage followed the logic of local geography. Eyre and his companions skirted lakes and broke into country whose names had already begun to be spoken with weary familiarity in Adelaide, Lake Torrens among them, and they reached as far as Mount Hopeless, a bleak outcrop that became a natural terminus. The inland felt no compulsion to comply with maps drawn by hands that had not walked its salt. Salt lakes lay white and scabbed, channels that promised drainage were dead, and the hints of water were too small to sustain a caravan. Men realized with a clarity that carried both frustration and prudence that the centre would not yield a navigable route. Mount Hopeless, with its stark slopes and the same uncooperative sky, forced a strategic hard turn. If the inland would not be conquered, perhaps the coast could be used as a corridor. The expedition would pivot. This pivot brought a second phase, a coastal strategy that married ship and shore. The government vessel Waterwitch shadowed the party for parts of the journey, offering resupply and a kind of maritime insurance policy. Eyre established depots and walked stretches where the coastline and sea-berthed plains met. From Port Lincoln to Streaky Bay, officers and men tried to reconcile the idea of a land route with the reality of a coastline that, for long stretches, looked hospitable, and yet hid the same inhospitable geology inland. The water witch's presence allowed for bold experiments. Longer stretches could be attempted with the knowledge a ship might appear if a stage ended badly. Observations could be checked against actual seafaring maps, but that maritime lifeline also induced a dangerous assumption that the ocean, visible and mapped, guaranteed inland patience. It did not. On the coast, the Nullarbor looked different but was no kinder. Salt flats ran inland in a slow bevel. Scrub mimicked meat, and yet starved animals that grazed it into a thinness that left them vulnerable to collapse. Eyre's party began to experience losses of horses, the true engines of mobility. In a land where the nearest water might be many miles off, a weak horse was worse than a dead one. It could not carry a man to safety, and it bled resources. With each animal that went down, choices hardened. Provisions were already thin, there were casks of water buried as caches along trails, but burying casks created a brittle dependency on memory and accurate retracing. Sometimes they were dug up, sometimes they were lost or misremembered, sometimes the land had shifted the exactness that maps demanded. Men learned, as they had to ration not just food and water, but trust. It is in these slow pressure points, buried casks, rationed bread, a horse that will not rise, that human character is most often revealed. Eyre's leadership was tested not in grand moments of ceremony, but in the calculus of small survival decisions. Men moved in a shrinking circumference of agency. They could decide how much to give a horse before it was shot, how many meals to stub down for a morrow that might not exist, whether to press on or to set camp and risk being overtaken by thirst. Eyre's choices followed a mix of discipline and improvisation. The party kept diaries and logs with dates and distances, medical notations and weather observations, for the mission had a scientific remit as well as a practical one. Yet the data rarely seemed to quiet the hunger or the thirst. Among the most important elements to survival, one that would become starkly clear as the expedition pushed west, was indigenous knowledge. Eyre's party included Aboriginal men who could read the land in ways an outsider's map could not. They knew signs of water, where a hollow might hold moisture after the dry season, how tracks betrayed an underground spring. Wiley is the most consequential of these guides, and any honest retelling emphasizes how his skill would come to mean the difference between life and death. He tracked animals and people, detected the taste of water in the soil, led men to wells that had been hidden by time and desert. His contribution was not romantic. It was technical and practical, the sort of knowledge that turns the impossible into the possible. Yet the social economies of the colony often translated such expertise into marginal recognition, an outcome that would leave a bitter aftertaste in the expedition's history. After the coastal trials, Eyre resolved to attempt a westward crossing that would take him over the Nullarbor's deepest reaches. The party's logistics became an exercise in arithmetic and endurance. Casks were buried at points along the projected route to ensure supply, but burial meant dependency on accurate retracing. Horses were inspected each morning for signs of collapse. Those showing too much fatigue were shot and used for meat. The meat of an exhausted animal was never treated like a trophy. It was the calculus of necessity. Men, too, grew thin. The constant sun baked the features of faces into mask-like dryness. The mouth's membranes cracked. Sleep came in jagged fragments, and dreams were mostly of water. Pools, streams, any moving silver that would catch light and promise relief. The first days of the westward push were marked by an ordinary kind of cruelty. Water wells that were dry when expected to be wet. Caches whose positions had shifted in memory. Tracks that ran for miles without revealing a blade of green. The land's monotony was a weapon. Where a forest gives layered signs, broken branches, bird calls shade, a featureless plain offered only absence. It magnified mistakes. When a cask was mislaid, the party could not simply turn back. Distances between viable points were large, sometimes hundreds of kilometers, and each misstep could mean a multi-day march without replenishment. Men began to measure their walking in terms of how many hours a horse could still be expected to carry a load. A single miscalculation changed the mission's geometry. Where once men calculated to expand knowledge, they now calculated to survive. It was in this geometry of scarcity that the first profound losses occurred. Eyre recorded horses dying in the sun, pinned in the obvious vulnerability of their flanks, unable to rise. The men had to shoot some animals to prevent them from prolonging suffering and to reclaim the meat for the living. These were grim necessities documented without flourish, decisions made and recorded, the ethical weight reduced to the urgency of the next day. Food was rationed in growingly severe increments. There were days counted where a biscuit might be split among 3 men, or the meat of a single horse parceled to stretch morale and muscle. The men's hands became calloused in new places, not just reins and ropes, but at the edges of a tin cup passed among the thirsty. Amid the deterioration of physical condition, something else began to grip the party, an erosion of security and cohesion. The colonial venture had assumed certain hierarchies would hold when the map was uncertain. Command would enforce discipline, reason would outlast panic. The land, however, introduced a different law. Hunger and dehydration loosened the bonds of order in small ways that could have been easily overlooked until they were not. Men began to complain in terse notes in the journals. Small thefts occurred, of food or tools, sometimes out of cunning, sometimes out of desperation. Eyre's records and later accounts suggest that the strain of scarcity made moral calculus fungible. What had been theft in Adelaide could be argued as survival on the plain. Throughout these months, Eyre's character shows itself in the rhythms of leadership. He kept records, he rationed with decisions that mixed severity and mercy, and he tried to maintain morale through example and through the promise that an end would be found. He walked ahead at times, testing ground and making sure a path was secure. In later retellings, his voice is often firm, clipped to the point where it reads like a log entry: weather, distance, condition. Yet those clipped notations cannot hide the reality that many decisions were gambles. When to shoot a horse, when to bury a cask deeper, when to send a small party ahead to scout for water, each choice was a bet against a landscape that rarely cared for human wages. Wiley's role intensified as the crossing pushed west. With maps suggesting routes and the men following compasses and dead reckoning, Wiley operated in a different epistemology, one built on signs the others barely noticed. He could tell from the insect tracks where a spring lay, or from the way a certain shrub curled, that a well might be near. Eyre and the others began to rely on Wiley's instincts in concrete ways. He could find wells that had been used by Aboriginal people for generations, spots where water gathered under a crust of soil and arid rock. These discoveries were not the product of chance, but of attentive skill, of a lifetime learning to read details that European eyes had overlooked. Wiley's ability to bring men to hidden water would prove indispensable. Without him, the expedition's later collapse might have had a deadlier arithmetic. As the party reduced in size and horses thinned, the expedition's pace contracted. Buried casks were exhumed with desperate hands, sometimes found dry, sometimes half full, sometimes entirely missed. Men's diaries show small acts of improvisation, tying leather to carry a trickle of water, boiling brackish pools in hope of extracting anything potable, rationing meat down to an art. The landscape, however, did not respond to stoic inventiveness. It responded only to weather and the subterranean patterns of water. The Nullarbor is a place where human ingenuity runs up against geology. It can be outwitted for short stretches by skill and luck, but the plain's fundamental arithmetic, low rainfall, porous limestone and heat, is not altered by courage. The myth of the inland sea began to look like a misreading of Flinders maps and colonial desire. Coastal charts, while accurate for the shore, were not evidence of inland abundance. The false expectation that a watery heart existed within the continent had pushed men like Eyre to risk their lives on assumptions that would have to be corrected by experience. This mismatch, maps suggesting ease where none existed, was one of the expedition's essential lessons. It exposed a colonial hubris that mistook charted edges for interior generosity and corrected that hubris in the most uncompromising manner, through loss. After weeks on the coast and into the Nullarbor's interior edge, the expedition faced a practical limit. Supplies were not merely low, They were approaching the point where options narrowed to a binary: conserve and hope for relief, or risk a longer march to a place that might not exist. Eyre made the kinds of calls the journals dutifully record: where to set up a cache, how far a party might safely travel in a day, which animals would be spared another mile. They began to mark the land not for future colonists only, but for their immediate survival. A notch here, a cairn there, a buried pot. These were pragmatic acts, small human inscriptions on a plain designed to erase such things with time and weather. But the inscriptions mattered because they were records of lives clinging to a plan. The psychological strain matched the physical. Men reported dreams of wells and rain. Some wrote with a spare lyricism about the unrelenting whiteness, a lid on the world, a brightness that was both visible and threatening. The sun became not merely weather, but a character in the story, an agent that dried sound and distorted distance. The most mundane noises, the creak of harness, the clink of a tin cup, were amplified by night as companions listened for anything that suggested life beyond their immediate ranks. The atmosphere of the camp tightened like a wire. Small quarrels were not uncommon, anxieties expressed in clipped phrases, in glances that lingered too long, in furtive movements toward another man's ration. By the time the party pushed away from the last known supply point and into the broad white, the composition of the expedition had altered. Some men had been sent back with word and partial reports. Others had been left at outposts to maintain a line of communication. The corps that continued westward was a narrower bundle of souls, Eyre among them, Wiley now central to their calculations, a handful of men who would follow him across a landscape whose features had now become personal to each of them. They carried the knowledge of caches buried in soil that might change with erosion. They carried the memory of horses that had failed them and the weight of choices to shoot animals so the living might live. What awaited them was not a single event that could be predicted. It was a compound of misfortunes, marginal decisions, and one central geographic fact. The Nullarbor does not yield water easily. Yet even when the future was not yet decided, certain things could be read with clarity. The expedition's planners had underestimated the simple arithmetic of water and stock consumption over long, dry stretches. They had assumed the coast and the map could temper the interior's austerity, and they had, perhaps most consequentially, underestimated how a group's cohesion could fray under prolonged scarcity. There is a final, quieter shock, teetering at the edge of what had already been suffered: the moral economy of recognition. From the earliest days of the expedition, official records and later celebratory accounts would prize measurements, charts, and names placed on maps. Eyre's meticulous journals would be read as evidence of a successful exploration despite the human cost, and medals and memorials would follow. But even as the expedition collected scientific observations and mapped new ground, the contributions of men like Wiley were measured differently by the colony's social mechanism. Practical expertise that saved lives did not automatically translate into equal renown. This imbalance would not be resolved by the crossing itself. It would echo into the aftermath and shape the story the public would tell about courage and discovery. For now, as the party tightened its belts and slung the last of their tools over tired horses, the immediate future felt like a single breath held too long. Casks were reburied more carefully. Horses were driven in shifts to conserve energy. Men kept their eyes on the horizon for any color or shadow that might be water. The sun carved their days into a monotonous rhythm. Each mile walked westward was a negotiation with scarcity. Each night, conversation dwindled to practical plans. Each morning, the white expanse returned, as if it had not been impacted by the footfalls of men at all. And yet, even amid exhaustion, there were small human gestures that registered in the record. A meal shared when little was left, a map corrected for the benefit of those who might follow, a notated spring whose coordinates would be saved in a pocketbook. These were the ordinary heroics, not dramatic rescues so much as continual acts of attention to one another. Eyre's journals persistently mention such details because the mission had to balance the demands of exploration with the ethics of keeping men alive. It is here, on the edge between the coping of hardship and the unraveling of order, that the expedition hovered as the westward crossing deepened. The land's indifference had already imposed a lesson. The colony's assumptions about the interior had been corrected, if only partially. What remained was whether the party could continue its narrow arithmetic of survival long enough to reach a place of resupply. Much of their future would depend on decisions made in small, dim moments. Whether a buried cask would be correctly found the next day, whether a horse could walk another mile, whether a man could resist the compulsion to take what was necessary for himself at the expense of the group. Beyond these technicalities, the story also held a quieter human question. What happens to a group when the idea of return becomes more speculation than plan? How do men ration trust alongside food? How is authority maintained when every choice can mean life or death? History often frames exploration as a straightforward sequence of triumphs and maps, but the Nullarbor crossing revealed exploration's other face, the slow abrasion of hope and the ways communities fray in the face of relentless environment. As they moved deeper into the plateau, the party's path narrowed not just physically but morally. The plane's sharp arithmetic demanded what few maps could predict. Loyalty weighed against survival, hierarchy held against the appetite that stripped distinctions. Eyre continued to write, his entries now shorter and more practical, but the margins of his notes carried the residue of daily calculation. How many miles to the next planned cache? Which horse showed signs of giving out? How to conserve a dwindling biscuit? While his foot became the compass the others learned to trust, his knowledge a quiet counterweight to the colony's charts. And then the expedition approached a region of the Nullarbor, where small topographical changes made a world of difference, a stretch where caves and sinkholes might harbor groundwater a few feet beneath a sun-baked crust, where signs in foliage were subtle enough to be missed, but clear to an eye trained by generations on the land. It was here that every careful choice would be tested anew, where the difference between finding life-sustaining water and losing everything was a handful of soil read correctly. The party tightened its formation, each man acutely aware that the next decisions were not merely administrative, but existential. In the last days before the deepest crossing, the record, sparse, urgent, shows the party making preparations that would later be read as foreshadowing. Implements were checked, the remaining horse stock examined with clinical attention, and caches were set with a renewed sense of ceremony. The plane had become a judge and the men its defendants. They moved with the collective nervousness of those who know that patience is not an abstract virtue, but the only currency serious enough to buy survival. The sea's edge, once a comforting boundary, was now a memory. The interior's white horizon was all that existed. At dawn on the morning they committed to the full traverse, the men left their last sea-facing camp with an odd, private kind of silence. There were no flags planted in triumph, no proclamations of discovery. The march began as it had continued, methodical, measured, with the world above indifferent and the ground beneath secretive. Each footfall punched a small, ephemeral hole in the Nullarbor's vast anonymity. They walked into a landscape that would not be impressed by names, medals, or future plaques. The true test of their venture would not be what they added to the map, but what they could keep of themselves on the way. They had not yet reached the moment that would be written in harsher ink. The fatal night, the theft, the collapse into two survivors, and the desperate, remarkable role of Wiley in bringing those two to rescue. Those episodes belonged to the next phase of the crossing, where the calculus of survival would transform into a story that mixed violence and devotion, theft and loyalty, loss and an improbable salvage. For the moment, the expedition kept moving, the sun tracking them like a slow clock. Each mile a new negotiation with a continent that refused to be simplified. It is worth pausing here, in this long stretch between plan and catastrophe, to reflect on the lessons already visible. The stunning geography of the Nullarbor had corrected the colony's fantasies of an inland sea. The expedition exposed the limits of maps when they met the ground's subterranean realities. It made plain the indispensable nature of indigenous knowledge and the imbalance of credit that such knowledge would receive afterward. And it showed, with unadorned clarity, that survival on such a plane was not an act of heroism alone, but a string of small, often lonely decisions about animals, caches, and trust. As the party pushed into the plane's heart, the reader of the journals can almost feel a pivot in the air. the kind that precedes a storm. Men walked with measures in their heads, instruments were consulted, boots wore grooves into the white, calcareous earth. Behind every measured distance there was an unmeasured tension, a moral human suspense, about how the group would hold together when the brittle arithmetic of provision finally snapped. The Nullarbor had already told them its first secret, the land's indifference, and it still had a second, more intimate revelation to give. That revelation would make the expedition's story notorious, not just for the environment's harshness, but for the ways human beings respond under such pressure, and for who history chooses to remember when the maps are updated and the medals are handed out. The night that marked the expedition's collapse arrived without drama in weather and with everything in motion beneath it. The sun had left the plain in its habitual glare. The men had gone through their routine of counting, measuring, and conserving. Rations had dwindled to a point where a biscuit was the arithmetic of survival, and a horse, once a capital asset, had been reduced to both burden and providence. Tension hung in the camp like a low cloud. Small slippages in trust, an unaccounted biscuit, a tool missing from the shared pile, had accumulated into a brittle tension. The plane had not yet forced a single decisive error. It had been chiseling away at cohesion in incremental strokes. Then a gunshot split the night. It was a sound that carried a different meaning out on that leveled white. Not just a weapons report, but an epical collapse in the group's moral geometry. John Baxter, a steady presence throughout the crossing, fell to that shot. The immediate fact is stark and unavoidable in the records. Baxter was killed. Two of the Aboriginal teenagers traveling with the party, Neramberain and Kutacha, departed the camp that same night, taking firearms, supplies, and a portion of the provisions with them. What followed was a cascade of consequences, bound more to survival arithmetic than to courtroom narrative. Contemporary journals record the scene with the bluntness of men who still needed to keep their wits. Eyre described the discovery of Baxter's body and the sudden realization that rations had been reduced by flight and theft. The practical effect was devastating. Firearms and ammunition gone, food and a few casks removed, the fragile calculus of expected water and days to the next cache irrevocably altered. Accounts suggest motives are unclear. Some later writers speculated opportunism, others desperation, but the primary documents insist on uncertainty. It is believed that Neramberain and Kutacha left with the hope of securing independence or safety elsewhere. The record does not provide a conclusive verdict on their inner reasoning. That ambiguity must be named and left standing. What the facts do make clear is this: the party's numbers and resources were suddenly halved in the most consequential ways. The theft of guns and supplies turned a precarious survival plan into a near impossibility. Eyre was left with few choices. The remaining men could not hope to maintain the same formation or carry the same loads. They were forced into hard, immediate decisions: who carried what, how far they could march before water ran out, whether to attempt to retrace steps for lost caches that might already have been tampered with. The expedition's trajectory, once planned in careful stages, narrowed to the narrowest of questions: how to keep two men alive. Into this void, Wiley's presence became decisive in ways that the colony's language of medals and maps would struggle to honor. He was no sentimental figure. Contemporary descriptions present him as calm, attentive, and technically skilled. In the days after Baxter's death, Wiley's knowledge of the landscape assumed absolute priority. He could read the land in a language of signs that others could not. Where Eyre and his remaining companion measured with instruments and compasses, Wiley read water in insect trails, in the subtle change of scrub, in the way particular lichens clung to a stone. He pointed to hollows that might hold groundwater, to the right, depressions where one should sink a shallow well. He wrapped a strip of leather around his hand to draw moisture, and the men watched as a grain of dampness appeared, enough to promise a cupful if the skill were applied. The march that followed in the wake of the murder was not cinematic heroics, but a slow, meticulous retreat from catastrophe towards salvage. They moved in shorter bursts, resting horses more often, shifting loads with painful calculus. When they stopped, it was to dig where Wiley had indicated, to sink shallow holes and feel for the wetness that might not be visible to untrained eyes. There are passages in Eyre's log that read like a ledger of gratitude. They note, often simply, that water was found by Wiley. Those 3 words in several places carry the weight of what kept the two alive. On several occasions, Wiley did more than indicate wells, he conserved them. Understanding that scattered, fragile sources could be exhausted or contaminated, he instructed on shallow digging, on where to place stones as windbreaks to reduce evaporation, on the ways one should approach a waterhole without bringing salt or debris that might render it useless. These are not the gestures of a passive guide. They are the actions of a practitioner who treats survival as a suite of techniques handed down and refined through experience. Eyre's journal, while formal and measured, betrays a growing dependence. He lists distances and days, but the entries often end by noting Wiley's finds and the immediate practical outcomes: 2 cups, a boiled ration, a horse spared another mile. The stretch toward the coast where rescue might be possible was long, measured in days and in the slow atrophy of strength. The 2 men's bodies narrate their own descent: muscles that failed at the mount, feet blistered and raw, lips cracked and bleeding at the edges. Their faces recorded thirst in hollows under cheekbones. Sleep came only in fits. Yet alongside corporeal decline, there were acts of ingenuity. Eyre used the last of his navigational instruments not only to chart a path but to set the coordinates for future reference, to name, in practical terms, where Wiley had found water, so that a map could be more than an imperial claim. It could be a literal saving grace for those who might follow. When they reached the coastline, exhaustion had carved new features onto them. The meeting with the French whaler Mississippi occurred at a coastal inlet where the sea was visible again, and the salt on their skin tasted like a bitter confirmation of survival. The Mississippi, well armed for whaling and far from the politics of British colonial life, took the 2 aboard. Contemporary accounts recount a scene of quiet relief. Men who had been reduced to the most immediate forms of human need now aboard a vessel where food, fresh water and rest were available. The whalers' kindness in rescuing them was practical rather than sentimental. They had seen sailors before and knew of such exchanges in whaling lore. A ship's duty to a survivor was immediate. From the Mississippi, Eyre and Wiley were conveyed to the nearest settled town, Albany, where they received medical attention and the chance to restore strength. Eyre's eventual journey back to South Australia and London would be marked by official recognition, medals, the recording of his surveys and the naming of features along the route. The scientific data and corrected maps he produced were taken seriously. Reports in colonial centres treated the crossing as both a correction of geographic misconceptions and as confirmation that British presence in Australia could extract knowledge from its interiors, even at cost. Yet the public ledger of credit and honour is not an even ledger. Wiley was noted in official lists, and he received recognition. A medal and a small pension were granted in acknowledgement of his service. The gist of the awards mattered, but their scale and the public memory that followed show an uneven distribution. Eyre's name became a headline, a place name, a credential. Wiley's medal appears in administrative ledgers and occasional mentions, but not with the same cascade of public adulation. The markers on maps, peaks, springs, plains, tended to bear the names of European explorers even when indigenous knowledge had been the key to finding the resource itself. This asymmetry is one of the expedition's lasting shocks. Survival depended heavily on Wiley's skill, yet popular memory and colonial commemoration remained skewed. The fate of Narambarine and Kutacha is also a disquieting partial story. They left in the night with provisions and the means to survive. They disappeared into the plain. Some later accounts suggest attempts were made to track or negotiate, but the record settles mostly on the fact of their flight and the ambiguity around their motives. The historical documents do not paint a simple villain or a clear despot of choice. Instead, they present a fragmentary picture of 2 teenagers who made an irreversible decision in the pressure of scarcity. That scarcity, not merely individual failings, was the engine that produced the night's violence. Whether their act was one of calculated theft, of flight to another community, of revenge or of desperation cannot be asserted with complete confidence. It is one of the many uncertainties that the expedition left behind. The public story that followed the crossing was, in some ways, predictable. Eyre's writings, the corrected maps and the narratives of endurance fit neatly into the period's appetite for tales of exploration. Official honours followed, medals, public commendations, and the cementing of his name into the colony's geography through place naming, all consistent with a colonial archive that prized measurable additions to knowledge. The scientific and cartographic corrections, demonstrating the absence of an inland sea where many had hoped for one, became part of the technical legacy. The Nullabor's true nature was no longer a rumour to be corrected by conjecture. It was a fact geometrically represented on maps and in reports. But the quieter legacy concerned memory and inequity. Wiley's recognition, while real in administrative terms, did not elevate him into the same cultural prominence as the officer whose journals bore the crossing's official account. In the colony's commemorative landscape, plaques and named ranges often celebrated the man who led the survey without equally celebrating the skill that had saved him and his companion. This disparity is not merely an oversight in naming conventions, it reflects the colonial mechanisms by which authority and credit were authorized. Indigenous expertise could be recorded as a practical footnote, while the primary narrative upheld the explorer as the vessel of discovery. There are further, less visible consequences of the expedition that deserve direct attention. For one, the Nullarbor crossing forced a recalibration in colonial planning. The inland sea hypothesis, once a motivating dream, was publicly discredited. That correction had practical impacts. Plans premised on the existence of navigable interior water were shelved or rethought. Infrastructure and settlement patterns would follow the realities of the landscape rather than the fantasies of maps that conflated coastal promise with interior abundance. That in itself is an understated but significant shock. Colonial ambition had been premised on a misreading that only the plain itself could expose. The environmental lesson is equally unambiguous. The Nullabor's geology, its limestone bed, sinkholes and thin soils, renders surface readings deceptive. Vegetation that suggests pasture can be a siren. Insect signs that mark an inland water source can be missed by those trained only in European ecologies. The expedition demonstrated that survival in Australia often depended on knowledge systems developed over millennia by indigenous communities, knowledge systems that were empirical, tested and specific to local conditions. That revelation is less sensational than it is fundamental. Colonial success in mapping and surviving Australian interiors was frequently a product of indigenous skill, even when the public record recentered the European observer. Beyond immediate corrections to maps and survival narratives, the expedition's aftermath raises questions about how history selects its heroes. The medals and place names that followed demand scrutiny. They are not lies, the achievements were real, but they are partial accounts. The broader story requires an unvarnished look at who enabled survival and whose names were inscribed into public memory. In doing so, the expedition exposes the social machinery through which discoveries are narrativized. The chroniclers pen privileges certain actors, and monuments concretize those priorities. Over time, historians have come to a more nuanced view. Contemporary scholarship emphasizes the back and forth between indigenous expertise and colonial institutions, between maps and practices. Eyre is now read as both an experienced overlander and a man who relied on others in critical moments. Wiley is acknowledged as decisive, technical and central to survival, no longer merely a supporting figure in footnotes. This recalibration is part of a broader historical conversation about how exploration narratives are constructed and about the ethics of commemoration in a settler colonial context. The story's discomforting elements, the killing of Baxter, the flight of 2 companions, the rationing and the shooting of horses, remain raw. They are not sensationalized here. They are documented consequences of extreme scarcity. These are the shocking facts the title promises, and their shock is not in melodrama, but in the way they make explicit the costs of colonial ambitions when confronted with an indifferent environment. The men's suffering, the loss of life, the theft and the moral entropy that can accompany desperation are all part of the expedition's historical texture. Yet within that same texture, there is also an unexpected moral clarity, the indispensable nature of local knowledge. Wiley's methods, Tracking, locating shallow wells, conserving fragile sources were not mere acts of guidance. They were a different modality of geohistorical wisdom. Had his skill not been present and decisive, the expedition's death toll would likely have been higher. That truth complicates the sentimental heroism attached to an individual explorer and forces an ethical reassessment of credit and remembrance. Looking back from a modern vantage, the Nullarbor crossing is an instructive mirror. It shows how maps can mislead, how landscapes can enforce humility, and how human communities respond under pressure. It reveals the ways colonial institutions celebrated certain forms of knowledge while marginalizing others that were equally or more consequential. It asks us to consider how to remember in ways that encompass both scientific contributions and the lived technical wisdom of indigenous participants. The name The Shocking Secrets of the 1840 Southern Australian Expedition is provocative because it directs attention to the hidden truths that the crossing exposed. Environmental indifference, the fragility of order under scarcity, the brutal arithmetic of survival, the murder that ruptured the group, and the essential role of an indigenous guide whose saviorism did not translate into equal remembrance. Each of these elements is factual. Their aggregation is what delivers the shock. The plane did not merely test men's bodies. It exposed the assumptions of a colonial project and the uneven ways in which credit and memory would be distributed afterward. Eyre's later life and reputation would be complex. His reports changed colonial understanding and earned him honors. He continued to serve and to push in other explorations, shuttling between acclaim and controversy. Wiley, by contrast, returned to a life less visible in official histories. The medal and pension he received were tangible acknowledgments, yet they did not inscribe his name into the public imagination with the same force as the plaques and place names that made explorers household figures. That disparity is now part of the historical lesson. The names on maps are not full translations of the work that made the mapping possible. Today, when travelers cross parts of the Nullarbor, or when scholars revisit the expedition's journals, they are likely to encounter both sets of facts: the physical truth about the plane's geology and climate, and the social truth about how knowledge was exchanged and remembered. The plane itself remains indifferent. Its limestone bed and sparse rains continue to shape life and limit movement. But the human story, the mixture of endurance, failure, theft, devotion, and technical skill, persists in documents, in awards ledgers, and in the geography of names. The crossing's legacy also extends into practical lessons about exploration and planning. Misread maps and wishful projections can produce catastrophic outcomes when not checked against ground realities and local expertise. The Nullarbor taught that lesson in the currency of animals and people. Institutional humility, recognizing that local knowledge is not a footnote but a resource to be incorporated, could have changed how such expeditions were planned and how recognition was parceled out. If there is a final irony to the story, it is this: the ambition to connect a young colony across a continent met its most potent obstacle, not in indigenous hostility, nor in imperial rivals, but in the geology of the land itself. The plane's secret was not a treasure to be found, but a truth to be recognized. Once recognized, it reoriented the colony's cartographic imagination. The inland sea remained a ghostly hypothesis. In its place, practical knowledge, like Wiley's, turned out to be the instrument of survival. These are the recorded contours of the expedition's conclusion: the murder that severed the group's security, the theft that removed their tools of defense, the descent into 2 survivors, Wiley's remarkable tracking and water finding that kept them alive, the Mississippi's rescue, the arrival at Albany, and the aftermath of medals and naming that reflected a lopsided public memory. Each element is a documented fact. Together they form the shape of a story that is both spectacular in its suffering and instructive in its lessons. The Nullarbor remains what it was: an expanse resistant to romantic appropriation, indifferent to flags and plaques, and revealing in its demand that those who pass it learn its rules or perish. The 1840 expedition's shocking secrets are therefore not merely sensational gossip. They are the concrete consequences of environment colliding with empire, of human choices under duress, and of the social hierarchies that determined who would be remembered and who would be written into footnotes. If this account leaves you wanting more detail, maps, primary documents, and the journals that record each day's arithmetic, check the sources linked in the video description. There you will find transcriptions of Ayres' logs, administrative records noting Wiley's medal and pension, and references to the Mississippi's role in the rescue. The crossing across the Nullarbor is both a cautionary tale and a record of human ingenuity. To study it is to confront the hard arithmetic that unfamiliar landscapes impose. For those who find value in accounts that mix geography, human drama, and the politics of memory, subscribe to the channel to follow further deep dives into exploration histories and the sources behind them. The Nullabor's lessons about humility, about the urgency of acknowledging all who contribute to survival, and about the limits of maps, remain as relevant now as they were when those men walked into white infinity, counted their days by a drained kettle, and learned that the land keeps its own ledger.